72 years. Old doctor said Billionaire had 5 seconds to live, but the Maid's toddler refused to let him die. The penthouse on the 53rd floor of Harrington Tower was the kind of place that made architects weep with admiration and ordinary people press their faces against the glass of glossy magazines, dreaming of a life they would never touch. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across 3 walls, offering a panoramic view of downtown Chicago that shifted from silver gray in the mornings to a blaze of amber and gold when the sun made its slow descent behind Lake Michigan. The furniture had been selected by one of the most sought-after interior designers in New York. The kitchen held appliances that cost more than most family cars. The art on the walls, a Basquiat, 2 small Hockneys, and a sculpture that looked like frozen water, had been purchased not because the owner loved art, but because his financial advisor told him it was a sound investment. Marcus Harrington had made his first million at 22, his first $100 million at 26, and by 33, he was worth somewhere north of $4 billion, though the exact number fluctuated with the markets, and he had long since stopped checking. Money, for Marcus, had ceased to be a measure of achievement and had become simply the water he swam in, invisible, everywhere, taken completely for granted. He was tall, with dark hair that always looked slightly disheveled despite the best efforts of his stylist, and eyes the color of storm clouds over the lake, that particular shade of gray-green that made people look twice. He had the kind of face that photographers loved and that appeared regularly on the covers of business magazines alongside headlines like "The Ruthless Genius of Marcus Harrington" or "Why Everyone in Silicon Valley Fears This Man." He was quoted in those articles saying things that sounded brilliant and occasionally cruel, and he had never once called to correct the impression. The people who worked for him respected him. Some of them feared him. None of them, not a single one, would have called him a friend. He kept his personal life sealed behind walls thicker than the marble in his foyer. His parents had died in a car accident when he was 19, a Wednesday evening, a drunk driver on the interstate, a phone call that rearranged every molecule of the universe he had known. He had put himself through the rest of college on scholarship and sheer furious determination, channeling every ounce of grief into ambition, turning the ragged hole in his chest into rocket fuel. He had been running on that fuel ever since, and somewhere along the way, he had forgotten or perhaps chosen to forget that underneath all the momentum, he was just a man. Just a person who had lost his family on a Wednesday evening and had never fully stopped falling. He did not have close friends. He had had 2 serious relationships, both of which ended not because of dramatic betrayal, but because the women involved eventually said the same thing in different words. "I don't think you actually know how to let anyone in, Marcus." He had not argued with either of them. He was not sure they were wrong. His days followed a rigid structure. He was up at 5, at his private gym by 5:15, at his desk by 7. He took his meetings, made his decisions, responded to the crises that seemed to materialize constantly around a man who ran 6 companies across 3 continents and was back in the penthouse by 9 or 10 at night, where he would eat whatever meal had been left for him in the refrigerator, always portioned perfectly, always labeled with reheating instructions, pour himself 2 fingers of scotch, and stand at the window for exactly long enough to remember that he was alone before turning away and going to bed. It was a life that most people would have killed for. Marcus had begun, quietly and without quite admitting it to himself, to understand that it was also slowly killing him. The cleaning service that maintained the penthouse sent different staff on a rotating schedule, which meant that every few months a new face would appear on Tuesday and Friday mornings, moving quietly through the rooms while Marcus was at the office. He rarely saw them. He certainly never spoke to them. They were, in the way of his whole life, invisible to him, part of the machinery that kept his world running smoothly, no more remarkable than the elevator or the air conditioning. This arrangement changed on the 2nd Tuesday of October, when Lucia Reyes arrived. She came because the regular Tuesday cleaner had called in sick and Lucia had agreed to cover the shift on short notice, which her supervisor would later tell her was a decision that changed more than one life. She was 28 years old, with dark hair she wore in a practical braid, hands that moved with quiet efficiency, and a way of carrying herself that was neither apologetic nor arrogant, simply present, simply real, in the way that people are when they have learned that survival requires your full attention. Lucia had been through things that would have broken many people. She had immigrated from El Salvador at 19 with her aunt, worked 3 jobs to build a stable life, and then fallen in love with a man who turned out to be charming in all the worst ways, the kind of charming that hides its teeth until you are already committed. By 25, she was a single mother, her daughter Marisol just 3 months old, and she was starting over with the particular grim grace of a woman who has learned that starting over, while exhausting, is survivable. She had built something solid in the 2 years since. Nothing glamorous. A small apartment in Pilsen, a job she was good at, a daycare she trusted, and Marisol, 3 years old and currently the most extraordinary human being Lucia had ever encountered, a tiny person who laughed with her whole body and had opinions about everything from the color of her socks to the correct way to say goodnight to the moon. Marisol was the reason Lucia got up every morning, the reason she was careful with her money and her choices and her heart. On this particular Tuesday, the daycare had called at 7:30 to report a minor flooding situation, a pipe, nothing serious, everyone safe, and apologetically informed parents that the center would be closed for the day. Lucia had already committed to covering the shift. Her aunt was visiting family in Dallas. She had no one else. She did what she had done many times before in the quiet emergency of single parenthood. She bundled Marisol into her coat, packed the small backpack with the essential supplies, 2 juice boxes, crackers, a worn stuffed rabbit named Coco, and a collection of small plastic animals that Marisol carried everywhere as though they were her personal council of advisors, and she brought her daughter to work. She had called ahead and explained the situation to the building manager, who told her it should be fine since Mr. Harrington was never home before 8 in the evening. She would be done by noon. She would be careful. She would keep Marisol close. What she could not have predicted, what no calendar or careful plan could have accounted for, was that on this particular Tuesday morning, Marcus Harrington had not gone to the office. He had not gone to the office because at 4:30 in the morning, alone in the dark of his bedroom, he had felt something in his chest that he had been feeling with increasing intensity for 6 weeks and had been ignoring with the determined expertise of a man who has decided that acknowledging weakness is the same as surrendering to it. A tightening, a pressure, a wrongness that his body had been trying to tell him about and that his mind, sovereign and stubborn, had refused to hear. At 4:30 in the morning, lying flat on his back in a bed that cost more than most people's annual salary, Marcus Harrington had understood with sudden, terrible clarity that something was very wrong, and that he was alone, and that he was afraid. He was still lying there, gray-faced and rigid, and trying to convince himself it would pass, when he heard the front door open, and then the unmistakable, entirely unexpected sound of a small child's voice saying, with great confidence and no particular context, "Mama, this place smells like money." Lucia heard the change in the apartment before she saw it. She had been inside the Harrington penthouse twice before on backup shifts, and both times the place had had a particular quality of stillness, the kind that belongs to spaces that are maintained rather than lived in, where surfaces are clean because no one touches them and the air holds no memory of laughter or cooking smells or the small beautiful debris of daily life. It was a beautiful space in the way that hotel lobbies were beautiful, impressive, impeccable, and profoundly empty. This morning, the stillness had a different texture. It was the stillness of someone holding their breath. Marisol, who had been narrating their entrance with the unself-conscious authority of a 3-year-old who considered the world her personal theater, suddenly went quiet in that alert, animal way that small children sometimes do, not frightened, exactly, but tuned in, her small head tilting like a bird that has detected a sound below the range of adult hearing. "Mama," she said, in a different voice than the one that had commented on the smell of money. Softer. More careful. Somebody is hurted. Lucia set down her supply bag and looked at her daughter, and then she looked down the hallway toward the primary bedroom, and the door that was standing open an inch, and the thin pale line of early morning light that came through it. "Baby, stay here," she said. She set Marisol down in the entryway, handed her Coco the rabbit, and walked down the hall. She pushed the door open and saw him. Marcus Harrington was lying on his back in the middle of an enormous bed, fully clothed in the gray t-shirt and sweatpants he had apparently been wearing since the night before. His face was the color of old ash. One hand was pressed flat against his chest. His jaw was clenched so tightly she could see the muscle working in his cheek, and his eyes, when they opened and found her face, held something she had never expected to see in a man who appeared on magazine covers looking like he owned the world. They held pure, unguarded terror. "I called," he started, and his voice came out wrong, compressed and airless. "I tried to call my phone." She was already moving. She saw the phone on the nightstand, screen dark, battery dead. She would learn later that he had been trying to call for help for 2 hours, draining the battery before giving up and waiting for something he was too proud or too exhausted or too frightened to name. She pulled her own phone from her pocket, dialed 911 with steady hands, and gave the address in a clear voice that did not shake, because she had decided in the space of half a second that shaking was not something she had time for. While she was on the phone, she heard the soft pad of small feet on the hallway floor. "Marisol," I said. But Marisol was not listening, because Marisol had already crossed the room. She had climbed onto the bed. Lucia would never entirely understand how a 3-year-old had scaled something that high, and she was kneeling beside Marcus Harrington, studying his face with the grave, focused attention she usually reserved for injured birds and upset caterpillars and the other small creatures of the world that she felt personally responsible for. Marcus turned his head and looked at her. He later said, in a way that came out slow and unsteady, like he was just figuring it out as the words arrived, that he had expected to feel alarmed by a strange child appearing in his bedroom. He had expected the intrusion of it, the wrongness. Instead, what he felt when Marisol's serious brown eyes met his was something so unexpected he hadn't had a name for it in the moment. He felt seen. Not evaluated, not judged, not processed as a problem to be managed. Simply seen, the way you can sometimes only be seen by someone who has no agenda, no history with you, no reason to look at you as anything other than exactly what you are in this moment. What he was in this moment was a man who was scared and in pain and needed someone to stay. Marisol reached out her small hand and placed it flat on top of his hand, the one he had pressed against his chest, the one pressing down as though he could hold his own heart in place by sheer force of will, and she said, with the matter-of-fact certainty of a child who has not yet learned that some things are beyond our fixing, "I'm staying with you. You don't have to be scared." He closed his eyes. His jaw unclenched just slightly. The paramedics were there in 9 minutes. The next 4 hours were the controlled chaos of a medical emergency moving at institutional speed. Paramedics, the elevator, the ambulance, the emergency room at Northwestern Memorial, the rapid-fire questions, and the 4 lines, and the beeping machinery, and the cardiologist who appeared from somewhere and spoke to Lucia in the brisk, information-dense shorthand of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news to people who were not yet ready to receive it. She was not his family. She had no official standing here. But she was the only person who had come with him, and the cardiologist, Dr. Eleanor Voss, a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and the kind of face that has been shaped by decades of other people's grief, looked at Lucia and seemed to make a rapid calculation. "He has a condition called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy," Dr. Voss said. "It's genetic. He likely had it his whole life and never knew. It's been progressing for some time. I suspect he's been having symptoms for weeks and ignoring them." A pause. "He is extremely lucky that someone found him when they did. Another hour, possibly less, and we would be having a very different conversation." Lucia nodded because nodding was what her body did when her mind was still processing. "Is there family we should contact?" Dr. Voss asked. I don't know, Lucia said. I clean his apartment. I don't know his family. Dr. Voss looked at her for a long moment. Well, she said finally, with something in her voice that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one. Whoever you are, you may well have saved his life. In the corner of the waiting room, Marisol had fallen asleep across two plastic chairs, Coco the rabbit tucked under her chin, her small plastic animals arranged in a careful circle around her like a tiny guard. She had refused to leave the hospital until she knew the man with the scared eyes was going to be okay. She had said so plainly to 3 separate nurses and to Dr. Voss herself, who had crouched down to Marisol's level and told her, with complete seriousness, that her staying was very important and very brave. Marisol had accepted this as no more than accurate. Outside the window, Chicago moved through its Tuesday with no awareness that anything extraordinary had occurred. The lake was steel blue and indifferent. The traffic on Michigan Avenue did not pause. Billions of dollars continued to fluctuate in markets that Marcus Harrington could not see from his hospital bed, and none of it mattered, and for the first time in a long time, he knew it. He was in the hospital for 11 days. The first 3 were serious enough that Dr. Voss used words like critical stabilization and careful monitoring in a tone that made it clear these were not bureaucratic phrases, but precise descriptions of a situation that remained genuinely precarious. His condition required medication adjustments, a procedure to address the immediate structural concern, and the kind of rest that Marcus Harrington had not practiced in any meaningful way since he was approximately 12 years old. He was bad at it. He was spectacularly, almost impressively bad at resting. The nurses on his floor developed a rotation system for managing his attempts to have his laptop brought to him, and his executive assistant Diane, a woman who had worked for him for 6 years and possessed the particular unflappable confidence of someone who has survived many storms, fielded his phone calls from the hospital bed with the same calm efficiency she brought to everything else, while privately telling her husband that evening that she had never seen Marcus Harrington look frightened before, and that it was, in a way she couldn't entirely explain, a relief. Lucia had not planned to come back. She had made sure he arrived safely, had spoken to Dr. Voss, had made sure the hospital had a contact from his company, a number she found by calling the main line for Harrington Industries and explaining the situation to a very alarmed receptionist, and then she had taken Marisol home on the L train through the gray October afternoon, feeling wrung out and strange, and somehow larger than she had been that morning, as though the day had stretched her into a new shape. She had done what any decent person would do. She had done more than she was required to do. She was free to go back to her regular life. On Thursday, Marisol asked about the man with the scared eyes. She asked the way 3-year-olds ask things, directly, without prelude, as though the question had simply been sitting in her mouth waiting for the right moment. They were eating dinner. Marisol was arranging her peas into patterns and she looked up and said, "Mama, is the man better now?" Lucia said she thought so. "I want to check," Marisol said. "We should check. Baby, we don't know him." Marisol looked at her with a patient, slightly baffled expression she wore when adults said things that seemed to her obviously incorrect. "I held his hand," she said. "That means we know him." Lucia sat with that for a moment. There was no good argument against it, not one that would survive contact with the logic of a 3-year-old who had decided that hand-holding constituted relationship. On Friday afternoon, after her morning shift at a different apartment, Lucia took Marisol to Northwestern Memorial. She had brought a card, one of those blank ones with a simple watercolor flower on the front, and Marisol had drawn inside it with purple crayon, a drawing that was, according to Marisol, a picture of the man in the bed and herself, identifiable as such by the 2 round heads and the lines that were apparently hands. Beneath it, Lucia had written in Marisol's voice, "I told you I would stay. I hope you are less scared now. Marisol and Mama." She had intended to leave it at the nurse's station. She had not intended to go to room 714. She was, in fact, in the middle of explaining this to Marisol, quietly, in the elevator, in the way of mothers who know that their explanations are unlikely to succeed. When the elevator opened on the 7th floor and Marisol walked off it with the settled purposefulness of someone who knows exactly where she is going. He was awake. He was sitting up against the pillows looking at his phone with the expression of a man engaged in a battle of wills with an inanimate object, and when the door opened, he looked up with a slightly defensive expression of someone expecting another nurse come to confiscate his electronics. The expression changed when he saw Marisol. It did not shift into blankness or polite social distance. It shifted into something much more unguarded than that, something that moved across his face too fast for him to manage it back into the controlled neutral that was his habitual expression. Something that looked, Lucia thought, like relief. Like the particular relief of seeing someone you did not know you were hoping to see. "You came back," he said. His voice was quieter than she remembered it from the bedroom, less compressed by pain, but still careful, like someone testing whether the ground would hold. "She insisted," Lucia said, from the doorway. Marisol was already at the bedside. She had produced the card from the small bag she carried and was presenting it with both hands in the formal manner of someone making an official delivery. "I drawed you a picture," she said. "That's you and me. That's our hands." He looked at the drawing. He looked at it for a long time. When he looked up, his expression had done something that Lucia did not fully understand, but that made something in her chest pull tight. The same involuntary catch she felt sometimes at sudden beauty, at the way light moved on the lake, at Marisol laughing in her sleep.
"Thank you," he said.
He said it like he meant the word in all its weight, like he was thanking her not just for the drawing but for something he did not have precise language for yet. "You're welcome," Marisol said graciously, and then she climbed onto the chair beside his bed. She was very good at climbing, Lucia had noted, with the resigned admiration of a mother who has lost the battle against this particular skill, and she opened her bag of plastic animals and began arranging them on the tray table, explaining each one to Marcus with the thoroughness of a docent at a museum she personally curated. Marcus listened. He listened with a focused, genuine attention of someone who was not accustomed to this particular kind of conversation and was finding it, against all expectation, to be exactly what he needed. Lucia sat in the corner chair and watched her daughter hold space for this man who had everything and had nearly lost the only thing that actually mattered, and she felt the day rearrange itself around her in ways she would not fully understand for some time. They stayed for 2 hours. When they left, Marcus Harrington looked at the watercolor card, now propped against his water pitcher, the 2 round crayon heads with their connecting lines visible from the bed, and for the first time in 14 years, since a Wednesday evening on an interstate in Indiana, he did not feel entirely alone. He came home on a Thursday, 11 days after Lucia had found him. He came home to a penthouse that had been cleaned in his absence. His company had arranged this, and that was as pristine and silent as it had always been. The Basquiat was on the wall. The Hockneys held their light. The scotch was in its decanter on the sideboard. Everything was exactly as he had left it, and it had never looked more empty. Dr. Voss had given him very clear instructions. 8 weeks of reduced activity. No stress. Good food, sleep, and something she had said with a pointed directness that he recognized as calculated. Human contact, Mr. Harrington. I mean that medically. Isolation is genuinely bad for cardiac health. I am telling you this as your physician. You need to let people close to you. He had nodded in the way he nodded at things he intended to consider and then not act on. He was 3 days into his mandated recovery, restless and irritable and conducting 7 different email threads on his laptop when there was a knock at the door. He had not expected anyone. His building had strict security. He opened the door, still holding his laptop. Marisol was standing in the hallway with a small covered dish. Lucia was standing behind her, one hand on her daughter's shoulder, wearing the expression of a woman who has been overruled by someone a third her height. "She wanted to bring you soup," Lucia said. There was an apology in her voice, but also something else, the reluctant warmth of a person trying not to smile. "I made it." She supervised very closely. I stirred it, Marisol confirmed. Lots of times. He stepped back from the door. He did not think about whether to. He simply did it, the way you breathe, automatically, without the intervention of the careful, calculating mind that had governed most of his adult decisions. He stepped back from the door, and they came in. What happened over the following weeks was not dramatic. There was no single moment of transformation, no epiphany detonating in one clean blast. It was slower and realer than that. It was Soup on a Thursday and Marisol's running commentary on everything she encountered in the penthouse. She had strong opinions about the Basquiat. That painting is very loud, Mama, and was fascinated by the kitchen appliances and announced on her third visit that the window with the lake view was her favorite place in the whole entire world, even more than the swings. It was Lucia coming to her regular cleaning shifts and Marcus being home, and the two of them developing, awkwardly at first and then with increasing ease, a habit of conversation. Real conversation, not the transactional exchanges he conducted in boardrooms, not the performance of connection he had occasionally managed in relationships, but the kind of talking that happens when two people are in the same space often enough that the social scripts run out and you're left with just yourselves. He learned, incrementally, and then all at once, who Lucia was. He learned about El Salvador and the immigration and the 3 jobs and the marriage that hadn't been a marriage. He learned about the specific courage it takes to start over with a baby and a bruised heart and very little money and 0 self-pity. He learned that she had been taking online classes toward a nursing degree, 2 courses a semester, paying for them herself, building something brick by careful brick with the methodical patience of a person who has learned that there is no shortcut and that this is okay. He told her things too. Not immediately, not easily, but gradually, in the way that water finds its way through stone, persistently, following the path of least resistance, not forcing it. He told her about his parents. He had not talked about his parents with anyone since his 20s, when a brief and unsuccessful attempt at therapy had convinced him that excavating the past was not a productive use of time. He talked about them, now the way you talk about something you have been carrying so long you have forgotten it is weight, carefully, surprised by its heaviness once it was out in the air. Lucia listened the way she did everything, fully present, not filling the silences with reassurance or commentary, just receiving what he offered and treating it with care. And Marisol, through all of it, was simply herself. She drew pictures for him. She told him about her day, with the comprehensive detail of someone filing an official report. She fell asleep on his couch one afternoon during what was supposed to be a brief visit, and Lucia had looked at her daughter with that particular exhausted, luminous love of parents watching sleeping children, and Marcus had looked at the same sight and felt something in his chest that had nothing to do with his damaged heart and everything to do with the possibility of repair. He restructured his schedule. He did this quietly, without announcement, as though it had not required any effort. But Diane, who had worked for him for 6 years and knew the architecture of his days better than almost anyone, noticed immediately and said nothing, and felt privately that whatever was happening was something she had been hoping for longer than she would easily admit. He started leaving the office at 6 instead of 9. He ate dinner like a person instead of refueling like a machine. He called his cardiologist back when she called to check in instead of letting her calls go to voicemail. Small things. The compound interest of small things. On a Sunday afternoon in November, he and Marisol were on the kitchen floor. She had asked to make cookies, and he had agreed in the startled, immediate way of someone who does not stop to think before saying yes to things that matter, and they were both covered in flour, and Marisol was conducting a very serious investigation into what happened when you pressed your floury hands onto the dark kitchen tiles, and Marcus was watching her and laughing. Actually laughing, not the polished social version, but the real thing, unguarded and unplanned, rising up from somewhere that had been locked for a very long time. Lucia was leaning against the counter watching them. When he looked up and met her eyes, something passed between them that neither of them was ready to name. But it was there, undeniable, as real as the flour on the floor and the smell of something sweet beginning to rise in the oven. The second crisis arrived without warning, as crises always do when you have made the mistake of believing the dangerous part is over. It came on a December evening, 6 weeks after Marcus had come home from the hospital. He had been doing well enough that Dr. Voss had used the phrase genuinely encouraged at his last appointment, which Marcus had immediately reported to Lucia with the slight pride of a student who had received unexpected praise. He had been sleeping. He had been eating. He had been living quietly and with increasing conviction, like someone who intended to continue. He was at his desk at 6:30, wrapping up the last of the day's work, when his phone rang.
It was not Diane.
It was not his cardiologist. It was a number he did not recognize with a Chicago area code, and he answered it with the mild irritation of a man who gets too many calls. The voice on the other end was a woman from Illinois Child Protective Services. She was professional and precise, and the information she delivered was as follows. A complaint had been filed, an anonymous complaint, concerning a child named Marisol Reyes, age 3, daughter of Lucia Reyes, alleging neglect and unsafe conditions. An investigation had been opened. A home visit would be conducted within the week. Ms. Reyes had been notified. He sat very still for a long moment after the call ended. He knew, with a certainty that arrived fully formed and required no analysis, what this was. He had, in the past 6 weeks, made a number of quiet but significant changes to his professional and personal arrangements. He had reduced his availability to certain people. He had ended 2 business relationships that had begun to feel less like partnerships and more like extractions. One of those relationships had belonged to a man named Daniel Schreier, who had been a peripheral figure in Marcus's life for years, someone who operated in the gray zones of business, who had access to certain information about certain people, and who had, upon receiving Marcus's disengagement, made a comment that Marcus had filed away as an empty threat. It had not been empty. He called his attorney within 3 minutes. He called a private investigator he trusted within 5. He called Lucia 10 minutes after that. She answered on the second ring, and he could hear immediately, in the quality of her breath, that she already knew. She had received her own notification hours earlier and had been sitting with it since, alone in her apartment after Marisol's bedtime, holding the phone with both hands in the dark. "It's not true," she said. Her voice was steady in the way of someone who has used everything they have to keep it that way. "None of it is true. My daughter is, she's the most loved person and then the steadiness broke, just at the edges, just enough. I don't know what I did to make someone, I don't know why." "You didn't do anything," Marcus said. "This is about me. This is someone trying to hurt me, and they used you to do it." Because he stopped. "Because they knew you mattered to me," he did not say. "Not yet." "Because they thought it would work," he said instead. "It won't." He meant this with the absolute, foundational certainty of a man who has spent his entire adult life building and deploying power, and who had never, until this moment, had a reason to be grateful for it. What followed was a week of extraordinary, quiet, precise activity. His attorney moved with surgical efficiency. The private investigator traced the complaint to a burner phone purchased in a particular store on a particular date, a date, as it happened, that corresponded exactly with a meeting Marcus had attended where Daniel Schreier had been present. Marcus's legal team filed a countercomplaint. The CPS investigator who conducted the home visit to Lucia's apartment, a calm, thorough woman named Ms. Patterson, found a small, impeccably maintained home, full of books and art supplies and carefully labeled meals in the refrigerator, walls covered in Marisol's drawings and the evidence of a child who was radically, thoroughly loved. She closed the investigation within 48 hours, noting in her report that the complaint appeared to be without merit and potentially retaliatory in nature. Daniel Schreier's gray zone business days were, by the following month, over. Marcus did not discuss this publicly or in detail. He simply applied the full, unhurried weight of what he was capable of, and the problem resolved. But something remained after the crisis ended, something that the crisis had, in the process of threatening everything, clarified with the cruel precision that only genuine fear can produce. He had been afraid, in that week, in a way that was completely different from the fear he had felt on his back in the gray dawn of a cardiac emergency. That fear had been for himself. This fear, the fear that Lucia would be hurt, that Marisol's security could be threatened, that something precious and new and not yet named could be damaged by the careless operations of people who did not know or care what they were touching. This fear was for someone else. Entirely and completely for someone else. He had not been afraid for someone else in a very long time. On the Friday after the investigation was closed, he went to Lucia's apartment for the first time. He had always been the one with the penthouse, the location with the view and the kitchen and Marisol's favorite window. Going to Pilsen felt deliberate in a way that he intended. She opened the door. She had clearly been crying recently. Not now, but recently, and she had made no effort to hide it. Her eyes were clear and direct, and she looked at him the way she always looked at him, as though she were seeing him exactly, and he thought, as he had thought many times in the past 2 months, that being seen by this woman was the most disorienting and essential experience of his adult life.
"You didn't have to do all of that," she said.
"Yes," he said simply. "I did." She let him in. Marisol, who had been coloring at the kitchen table with the absorbed concentration of a professional, looked up when he came in and gave him the particular smile she reserved for people in her personal inner circle, full and immediate, like a door flying open. "Marcus," she said, with satisfaction. "I made you a picture. It was going to be a surprise, but you're here now, so." She held it up. It was the three of them, discernible by 3 round heads, and the connecting lines that were apparently always hands. He looked at the picture. He looked at Lucia. He looked at the small apartment full of books and love and drawings on the walls, and he understood, with the full weight of a man who has spent his life calculating value and had finally found something he could not put a number on, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Spring came to Chicago the way it always does, reluctantly at first, in suggestions. A crocus through sidewalk frost, a particular softness in the morning air, the lake going from iron gray to something lighter and more willing. By April, the trees along Michigan Avenue were beginning their annual improbable green, and Marcus Harrington, who had spent 15 years in the city without once stopping to notice this specific thing, noticed it now, every single morning when he ran the lakefront path at 5:30, and found that it moved him in a way he could not entirely explain, and had stopped trying to. He had been running again for 2 months, cleared by Dr. Voss with specific parameters, and something she had said at his last appointment while looking at his most recent cardiac scans with an expression of professional satisfaction. "I don't know exactly what you've changed, Mr. Harrington, but keep doing it. Your numbers look better than they did 5 years ago." He had not told her exactly what he had changed, but she had a daughter and she had eyes, and she had perhaps not required a detailed explanation. In March, he had done something that caused significant ripples in the business press and a great deal of confused discussion among people who had spent years constructing a particular narrative about who Marcus Harrington was. He had restructured the leadership of 3 of his 6 companies, promoting people who had been waiting years for the authority they deserved, and stepped back from day-to-day operations into a strategic advisory role. He had established a foundation, the Harrington Family Foundation, which several business journalists noted with curiosity used the word family when Marcus Harrington had no visible family, focused on 3 areas: cardiac health research, immigration support services, and early childhood education. He had called Diane into his office to discuss these changes, and she had sat across from him in her usual composed way, and when he was finished laying it out, she had said, "It's about time." And he had laughed and said, "I know," and that had been that. He had enrolled in something he had not done since college, a class. A single class, 1 evening a week, in something he had always told himself he did not have time for. He was learning to cook. He was, according to his instructor, a very serious and earnest student who asked too many questions but showed genuine promise, particularly with anything that required patience. On an evening in late April, He and Lucia and Marisol were in the penthouse kitchen making dinner together. This had become a regular thing. Not every week, but often a rhythm they had fallen into with the unforced ease of habits that feel less like decisions and more like returning to something that was always true. Marisol had her dedicated spot on the counter stool, from which she supervised operations and occasionally made contributions of dubious culinary value, but high entertainment. Lucia moved through the kitchen with the same efficiency she brought to everything, comfortable now in the space that had once been just a job, her braid over one shoulder and her laugh, which Marcus had decided was among the most valuable sounds in the world, surfacing regularly over whatever he was doing wrong that she was amused by. He had been planning what he wanted to say for 2 weeks. He had written versions of it and discarded them, not because the words were wrong, but because the whole enterprise of planning it felt wrong, felt like a business presentation, a pitch, something transactional dressed up in emotion. He wanted to say what was true. He had spent his whole professional life saying what was strategic. He wanted to say what was true. He waited until Marisol had eaten and had been installed on the living room rug with her animals and a specific cartoon she had strong opinions about. He and Lucia were doing dishes. She washed, he dried, and this too had become a ritual he prized with a possessiveness that would have baffled the man he had been a year ago. "I need to tell you something," he said. She looked at him sideways. "That sounds serious." "It is," he said. He set down the dish he was drying. "I mean, it's not bad serious. He stopped. He was extraordinarily good at speaking in public. He gave speeches that moved rooms full of people. He was currently incapable of completing a sentence. She turned to face him fully, and her expression, open, steady, patient in the way that was particular to her, made it both easier and harder. "6 months ago," he said, "I was lying on my back in that room, and I thought it was over. I thought I had run out of time, and the worst part, the part one couldn't get past, was that I looked at my life, and I couldn't find the thing that made it worth what it had cost. All of it. All the money, all the work, all the years I spent building something that was supposed to mean I had made it, and I couldn't find the part that mattered." He took a breath. "And then a 3-year-old climbed onto my bed and held my hand and told me not to be scared." From the living room came Marisol's voice, raised briefly in commentary on something happening on screen, then subsiding. "I'm not the same person I was that morning," Marcus said. "I am genuinely not. And I know you've built something real and careful and yours, and I know you've been hurt before, and I know that I would need to earn this and not just decide it the way I decide things. But I need you to know." He looked at her. "You and Marisol. You're the thing I couldn't find. You're the part that matters." Lucia was quiet for a moment. The kitchen light caught her face, and the lake was doing something with the last of the evening outside the window, and Marcus held himself very still in the way of a man who has learned, recently and at significant personal cost, how to wait. "She told me," Lucia said finally, "when we were on the train home from the hospital that first day. She said, 'Mama, that man needs us.'" A pause. "She's usually right about people." "She's extraordinary," Marcus said. "She is," Lucia agreed. And then, with the particular smile that he had learned was the one she saved for things that were real and irreversible and true, "So are you. Even when you're infuriating." He laughed, the real laugh, the one he had found again in a flower-covered kitchen in November, and she reached out and took his hand the same way her daughter had, 6 months ago, in a dark bedroom at 4:30 in the morning. Simply. Certainly. With a quiet, absolute conviction that some hands are meant to be held. From the living room, "Mama. Marcus. You should come watch this part, it's very good." They went. The following September, Dr. Eleanor Voss received an invitation in the mail. It was printed on good paper, and the envelope had a small drawing on the back of it, 3 round heads, 3 sets of connected lines, rendered in purple crayon. Inside, the invitation announced, in the formal language of such things, the wedding of Marcus James Harrington and Lucia Elena Reyes, to be held at a venue on the lakefront, in a ceremony described as small and intentional. In the lower left corner, in a child's handwriting that was getting more legible every month, were 3 additional words, clearly added after the formal printing. Marisol planned it. Dr. Voss, who had delivered a great deal of news over her 40-year career, news of the most serious and sorrowful kind, news that changed lives in single moments, news that required her to be composed when composure was the hardest thing, sat in her office with this invitation and allowed herself, for just a moment, to be completely undone by it. She had told his emergency room team, on that October morning when Marcus Harrington arrived by ambulance, gray-faced and alone, that he had perhaps 5 seconds of margin between the life he had lived and the one he would not. 5 seconds of grace. 5 seconds in which everything that came after either happened or did not. What she had not told them, what she had not known to say, was that those 5 seconds had already been claimed. That somewhere in a hallway, a 3-year-old in a coat with a stuffed rabbit under her arm had already decided that the man with the scared eyes was her responsibility, and had acted on that decision with the uncomplicated, total love that only the very young and the very brave are capable of. The little hand had held on. And it had been enough. It had been, in every way that could be measured, and in every way that could not, more than enough. For every child who has ever loved an adult back to life, and for every adult brave enough to let them.